Today marks the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, you may recall the invasion happened under the Biden administration's watch while the conflict between the two nations had been simmering and occasionally flaring up for nearly a decade. Last week, President Trump said Ukrainian President Zelensky was responsible for the conflict. Now, how is the question we should be asking is how so? Who is the real aggressor here? And what will be required to see this conflict ended? Joining me now to discuss this, Dr. A.J. Nolte, Chair of the Government Graduate Program and Director of the International Development Master's Program at Regent University, and he's also the Director of the Institute for Israel Studies at Regent. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always good to have you on the program.
Tony, always good to be here.
So President Trump recently said this war was started by Ukraine. Help us understand the context for this statement and how this war developed as we see it today.
Well, I think President Trump may have been alluding to a line of argumentation that the Russians, as well as some scholars in academia have made, which is that essentially the war was provoked by Ukraine taking a more Western orientation, potentially the possibility that they might join NATO, the possibility that they might join the European Union. And the argument is that because Russia views Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence and as a buffer against the West, that this was provocative. Now, that argument makes a couple of assumptions, one of which is that Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. My understanding, at least, is that a lot of the folks in Trump's orbit, and sometimes Trump, have referred to themselves as nationalists. Nationalism, at its core, is the idea that sovereign countries get to make their own decisions. And certainly we wouldn't want somebody else, Canada, for example, having a veto on treaties that we, as the United States, could make. And so what Russia's saying is Ukraine is being aggressive because they, as a sovereign country, are considering joining organizations that we, the Russians, find threatening. And so it's sort of a bizarre argument, but that certainly is the perspective that the Russians are retailing, at least publicly.
But under what under what framework would that justify an invasion?
It doesn't. To be very blunt, this is a justification. And it's been a justification that the Russians have made for many of their aggressive moves against their neighbors, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Georgia, whether it's making threatening noises toward the Baltics. I think you have to understand the worldview and the ideology of Vladimir Putin, which is that he believes wholeheartedly that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. Let me say that again. Putin believes the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy. And so when he sees this as aggressive, he sees a lot of these countries that are now sovereign, independent countries as Russian territory. Now, that's not supported under international law. That's not something that anybody else believes, but it's part of Putin's narrative of how the world is supposed to work. Who's the antagonist in that? It's the United States. And what is so frustrating is that time and time again, American presidents have said, maybe we're to blame. Maybe we're the reason that we just can't have better relationships with Putin. Obama sent him the reset button, talked about having more flexibility after the election in 2012. We've heard this from early on. Trump said he could deal with him. Even President Biden allowed for the passage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is a major gas pipeline, to soften the policies of the Trump administration. President Bush said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Every single time one of those American presidents has done that, Putin has responded with some form of aggression against his neighbors. And so, the reality is, in many ways, President Trump is very innovative in terms of foreign policy. He likes to think outside the box, but his rhetoric about Russia and Ukraine is essentially doing the same thing that every administration has tried with Putin in the past and expecting a different result.
So let me draw kind of a parallel here, something you'd be familiar with when we look at Israel and what happened there after October the 7th. One of the arguments pushing back against the international community saying, well, we need to give Hamas land that they wanted. We need to move forward with a two-state solution. And of course, Israel and even the United States saying that, well, that would be rewarding the terrorist for what they did. Are we not doing something very similar here in the discussion with Russia after invading Ukraine? We're kind of siding with them, saying, well, you can keep this land, as we're understanding the negotiations as they're being proposed.
Yes. So I want to make a distinction here between some of the rhetoric that's coming out and some of the proposals. In terms of the proposals, I think a lot of the proposals about allowing for annexation have more to do with the recognition of exhaustion on both the part of the Russians and the Ukrainians than with an idea that this is a just outcome. It's more along the lines of there's a concern that there's not realistically enough capacity on the Ukrainian or the Western allied side to allow Ukraine to retake that territory. So that is a pragmatic kind of realpolitik. This is the best we can get. Putin wanted to take the entire country, and so survival is some sort of victory type of argument. I don't necessarily know if I buy it, but I think that's a reasonable position. Where I'm a little bit more skeptical is this idea that, in the course of these negotiations, we need to pretend as though Russia didn't invade a sovereign neighbor because it was taking actions that as a sovereign nation it's allowed to do, and because of an idea that in some sense, as Putin said in Russian language, that Ukraine was a historical mistake. Now, if somebody invades your country and says your country is a historical mistake, I would think as a good nationalist, somebody would say, well, no, that you have a right to defend yourself.
So as you point out, the rhetoric, one thing, what we actually, the resolution that we come out with is another. My concern is in some of this rhetoric that words matter. And when we say certain things, tyrants and terrorists around the world are listening to these things, and they're taking their cues off of them. And so we're up against a break, Dr. Nolte. I want to talk on the other side of the break some of the rhetoric about how Zelensky, and I'm agnostic. I'm not a big fan. I don't think we should have been involved there to the degree that we were anyway. But I'm just concerned about some of the rhetoric. And I want to talk about the issue of him being a dictator, not holding elections. I mean, who's the real dictator here between Ukraine and Russia? So we're going to talk about that next when we come back from the break. All right, Dr. Nolte, the end of this, where the president ends up, I may be completely in agreement with. But I want to focus for just a moment, again, as we were talking about the rhetoric, the things that are being said, that I think, I guess I place a high priority on words. Words matter, and they literally shape the course of behavior and action. And I'm not here to defend Vladimir Zelensky, but I certainly know the record of President Putin in Russia. Let's talk a little bit about his record and who the real dictator is here.
Yeah. So the argument that Zelensky is a dictator is based on the fact that after the invasion of Ukraine, in which major cities were being bombed on a regular basis and all sorts of military action was happening rapidly, the Ukrainian president and parliament jointly declared martial law. And the martial law decree has been in effect since 2022. It would require both the president and parliament to remove that martial law decree. There are some people that have argued that the martial law decree should be removed. I think if you want pretty good evidence that Zelensky is not a dictator, look at the fact that he offered to resign this weekend and said, if you guarantee the security of if I'm the problem, if you need to get rid of me to guarantee the security of Ukraine, then I'm happy to resign. That's not a thing that dictators do. We can contrast that with Vladimir Putin, who has essentially either rigged or severely harassed, intimidated any opposition, rigged elections, done everything that you would expect from a dictator, unilaterally changed the constitution so he could run for more terms. Briefly, he quote unquote stepped aside, but he was still the prime minister. He put in one of his close allies, Dmitry Medvedev, as president for a few minutes. But Medvedev basically did everything that Putin told him to do. So I think it's very clear at this point that the guy who's been in power since 1999 and has a constitutional remit to stay president until 2036 is probably the dictator.
So let's talk about how he'll respond if there is a peace agreement. Mm-hmm. Can we trust him to abide by the terms of any peace agreement?
I would say past performance is indicative that the answer is no. He has generally, if given any opportunity to take more, he has done that in the past. You could look at Georgia in 2008. You could look at Ukraine in 2014. This isn't the first time that Putin has invaded Ukraine and taken territory. In 2014 it was Crimea and the parts of the Donbass, which are the areas where often the war is still going on now. So it doesn't seem like he has really had any respect for any past peace agreement. And so the danger that you have with the Trump administration, with the course that the president is taking right now, is you surrender the high ground, you get a peace, and then a couple of years down the line, when you're in your final year of office potentially, which is when Trump likes or Putin likes to do things like this, then all of a sudden he decides to go again. And then, as a lame duck president with a presidential election in the background, you've got to make a very difficult decision. I would say a tough line with Putin now is probably going to get you a better outcome than a more conciliatory approach, particularly given that every administration that's tried conciliation with Putin in the past, it hasn't worked. Trump won, the first Trump administration was very good, very tough on Russia in terms of policy. And I would encourage President Trump to look back at the successes vis-a-vis Russia of his first administration and take that posture, and not the failures of Obama and Biden, because unfortunately, conciliation with Putin has a lot more to do with the strategy of the Obama administration than it does with Trump's first administration.
I think, Dr. Nolte, we all want to see peace. As the president said, young people are dying there. The cost, both in human lives and material, has been exorbitant. But is the Trump administration too focused on getting to a deal and overlooking what you just laid out as the possible long-term consequences of a quick deal?
I would encourage the folks in the Trump administration to look at what recently happened with the Israel hostage deal, where it was like, we need to get a deal, we need to start getting the hostages out, we need to set things up in such a way that we can get to some sort of agreement. And then you got an agreement, and it has been such a horrific experience for Israel, and it's just created all these Hobson's choices for Israel and for her supporters. And I would be very much concerned about a quick push for a deal that doesn't have teeth and doesn't have a real way of making sure that Putin's going to comply, putting the United States and our allies in the exact same position.
All right, Dr. Nolte, just 1 minute left. So what does a good deal look like?
I think a good deal would require some sort of guarantees for Ukraine that would protect its national sovereignty and its right to exist as a nation, guarantees that would be provided by the U.S. and our allies. I do think the president is right. The Europeans need to step up more, but the United States is going to have to be involved to a certain extent. And I think ultimately, one of the things the Trump administration is doing that is very good is domestic energy production will weaken Russia's energy weapon. Mm-hmm. And so we can hope that with those things combined, there can be a positive outcome in the future. But ultimately, a good deal right now, I think, is going to be very hard to find.
All right, Dr. Nolte, always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us today, my friend.
Thank you. Glad to be here.